Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Not Content Podcast. On this podcast, we pour from the seemingly endless queue of movies, television shows, and maybe even other surprises along the way as part of our podcast channel From the Queue. Please subscribe, like, and review From the Queue on YouTube or your favorite podcasting platform, especially Spotify and Apple, as you can get those algorithms going with positive feedback. You can find us on BlueSky at From the Queue. You can find us through Instagram at From the Queue as well as Threads. If you're listening to us on YouTube, all of our links will be in the description below. My name is Jerome Cuson. You can find me on Instagram at Jerome Cuson. You can find me on BlueSky at Jerome C1985. My co-host is Brian. You can find him on Twitter for now at Brian DeBrain.
Let's go! Batter up! We're taking the afternoon off. It's a beautiful day for a ball game today. The fans are out to get a ticket or two. From Walla Walla, Washington to Kalamazoo. It's a beautiful day for a home run. But even a triple's okay. We're gonna cheer and boo and raise a hullabaloo at the ball game today.
On this episode, it's the start of a season-long project examining 9 baseball films from the past for the duration of the 2024 MLB season. We even talk a little baseball as well. We open up the first inning with the 1988 film, 8 Men Out. I'm Brian. I'm hosting this special project for the channel, and we've been talking about this for a while. Me and Jerome are very big baseball fans. I would say more of a baseball fan than I am a basketball fan at this point. Whenever I go to Vegas during the summertime, I seem to hit more parlays in baseball than anything. I seem to have that feel for it. And it's my, sports dream to coach a baseball team one day as like a sports fantasy. But that's hearsay for now. We're here to talk about the past and the history of baseball movies. And I've been kind of talking about how baseball movies have been kind of peaking the last 15 years or so. Kind of peaked with Moneyball, it feels like. But, back in the heyday, I would say the 70s, kind of brought it back a little with the, Bad News Bears. We're not going to start there. We're actually starting with 8 Men Out in 1988 because around this time was kind of like a big boom for baseball films. I feel like this was kind of the beginning of it. This was the same around the same time as Field of Dreams. Field of Dreams would come out the next year. So this was a big kind of like a boom period, even though this film in particular didn't do so well in the box office. I think it still like started a big boom period because Charlie Sheen is in it, and he would go on to do Major League right after this. And this would be an inspiration for Ken Burns in his documentary about baseball in 1994 and heavily influenced him in that regard. So I think even though this movie is kind of like under the radar for a lot of people in terms of sports movies and baseball movies, I think 8 Men Out is a great way to kind of educate people on the history of baseball. If people are interested in the history of baseball all the way to the beginnings, like this would be a great way to introduce them into that history as well. And for a lot of people who didn't know, including myself, when as a teenager, when I first heard about the Black Sox scandal, I didn't believe it. I didn't think it was real because the idea of a baseball team giving up the World Series on purpose was just, it's still into my head. It's like, it's mind blowing, right? But then we've heard about these scandals before in sports and stuff like that. Tim Donaghy in the NBA with the 2006 playoffs or whatever that was. It's very controversial. There's been a lot of controversial.
Literally, as we speak, the best player in baseball, we don't know the extent of the scandal, but he is involved in a gambling scandal as we speak, literally.
And I didn't plan this out. I did not plan this out. We planned this out before the news broke about that with Shohei Ohtani. So, yeah, this just weird timing, as we said before with this podcast. But unbelievably, this story is pretty phenomenal because it shows you that, baseball owners need to treat their players very well in order for them to be, wanted to be with the team, wanted to stay loyal to the team, wanted to play for you. And B, even though you decide to somehow, I don't know, if you want to be a guy like Shohei Ohtani, interpreter or whatever, and go with the gambling side of things, you still got to meet your masters when it comes to these gamblers and mafia men. They kind of exaggerated the ending a little bit by threatening the pitcher's wife, but still, like, this idea that you can't just get away from the mafia is very true. If you try to, like, start a deal with the mafia in the beginning of the series and try to bail out on the deal at the end, you kind of see both sides of that. So I was very intrigued by this movie. I love the cast of this movie. I know you love this movie before we even talked about watching this. So I was very intrigued. And you know, with this history of the Black Sox scandal, you said you did a presentation in school. So if you want to do a
I
little
did a
background
history
right
fair
now.
project. I did a history fair project on it, and I think I first got interested in the scandal because of Ken Burns baseball. And believe me, in the month of September, we are absolutely going to do either an episode or a full month on the Ken Burns documentary series because Brian has never seen it, and that is not okay. So we are going to
I've seen
rectify
clips.
this.
It's just really, really long, but I've seen YouTube clips throughout the
Let's
whole
be
back.
clear, it is the full thing is going to be watched by you and I very soon. So we have that to look forward to. But yes, Ken Burns' baseball made me very interested in the scandal because the White Sox are, of course, my team, and just learning about the process. And there is an incredible book which you have highlighted in the notes. Elliot Asanoff in 1963 wrote Eight Men Out, the Black Sox, in the 1919 World Series. And so much of the background of this scandal is contained within that book. And essentially, what happens is that even before 1919, they were known as the Black Sox because their uniforms were always dirty because the owner of the White Sox was so cheap that he would not even launder their uniforms. He would promise bonuses and then not deliver. Charles Comiskey generally had a very poor reputation in terms of ownership. So the players at this time, basically, a lot of baseball players were very much in the working class. It's not like now when guys are getting paid millions of dollars and this is just like it's just so ubiquitous at this point that a baseball player would not even consider getting an off-season job, for example. But back then, that's what they would do. They would teach, they would dig ditches, like work on the railroad. Like there's any number of potential jobs that they would do in the off-season because they needed the money so bad. So this situation made it very ripe for gamblers. There's a history of gambling within baseball, and the Ken Burns documentary does get into it. And again, it's something that continues to be with us to this day. You have Pete Rose. You have an individual like Shohei Ohtani, who has not been officially accused of anything as of yet, but who knows how that scandal is going to develop. But when you think about this entire situation, it is this is something that just kind of felt inevitable at a certain point. And you have a number of players that are involved, most prominently Joe Jackson, but also Buck Weaver, as played by John Cusack. And you really just have a host of players across the board. And the movie does a really, really good job of not really focusing on any one person, but really exploring the different facets of the scandal. Like, how would two kids from the south side of Chicago perceive this scandal? How would two reporters kind of be covering it? What's the mob angle? What's the player angle? Then the players kind of have, I mean, the players are not really characters so much as they do have their own individual perspectives. And I just love the way that this movie is laid out. I think John Sayles does a really good job of just making the world feel authentic. To me, again, I don't think that this is not a character driven movie per se. This is much more about telling the story. And I think if you go into that understanding, you're not gonna learn a great deal about like who Buck Weaver is as a person. You're not gonna get inside the head of Joe Jackson, but what you're gonna do is you are gonna have a very good understanding of how this situation plays out. And the casting is so good that it really does add a lot of pathos. I could go down the list here, but to me, I look at John Mahoney as Kid Gleason, like just playing the ultimate father figure. He does such a fantastic job. David Strathern also does an amazing job as Eddie Sicati. Just really adds a lot to that performance, and especially in the scene when he does his big confession at the end. I mean, those are the performances that stand out. But I'll talk about what is actually unironically my favorite performance shortly. But I think this movie is just built really well. It does feel like it's 1919. Brian, if you are a fan of hats, all I'm going to say is this is the movie for you.
The old school hats. We're talking 1910 style hats, 1915 style hats here. Yeah, I just love that old school look. I think the cinematography is great. I think the art direction's great. I think it just everything looks authentic to the time period. Even the baseball fields. I think they shot it in maybe was it St. Louis or something like that, and they kind of had to cover up a little bit, but still like look great. The old school park feel to it. The openness, like the lack of like technology where you got that bullhorn with the guy singing the national anthem on a bullhorn. That was tremendous because it just echoes through the arena. So that old school look like was so great for this movie. I love the opening where you see Christopher Lloyd and that other guy, the two of those mob figures types. They were basically going through the whole roster and trying to figure out who would be the types that would be in like willing to do a job, so to speak. And that way you get to go through the whole roster and get to know somewhat a little bit of each individual, but just enough to make a judgment about them based on their character and what they're going to do. So I thought that was a great way to intro you to the whole team in a smart way on the field to see their skills or whatever and how they're like, okay, this guy's a skilled player. If he does something later on, we know that he's doing something. You know what I'm saying? So I thought that was a great way to kind of like go over the roster, go over everyone's personalities, introduce you to these other two characters who seem shady. One of them being Christopher Lloyd in a great looking suit as well. I thought the suits in this whole movie was great. All the suits were great, but this movie opens up really well, and then once you kind of get past, okay, we're making these deals about fixing the World Series. Once you get introduced to the Rothstein character, once you get past that, the editing gets really good because it's pretty much the whole second act is what like each game covered individually, except maybe like one game. And then you also forget this is best of 9, so it's old school, so it's first to 5, and it's like that would just not happen nowadays because best of 7 at this point is still like pushing teams to the max. Best of 9, Jesus Christ, I can't imagine your pitching rotation going to a
I
best of
mean,
9
it's
series.
very different. It's a very different atmosphere. I mean, the way that these guys pitch now, like they have to pitch so fast and so hard. And back in the day, like the pressure on their arms just wasn't as much as it is now, and I think that's a big difference. But I mean, it's funny that we're talking about this gambling scandal, and literally the only reason that this series was 9 games is because they wanted more money, and that's just tremendously funny to me. Is that this series, 1920 and 1921, would be 9 game series instead of 7. There's also no playoffs too. That is worth noting. It's just you win the pennant and then you go into the 7 or 9 game series against the other league. There's no divisional series, no wild card, any of that business. Which I mean, in some ways, I think it's good. Some ways it's bad. But you see, I think the other thing that I really appreciate is that I think they do a good job of just portraying how Charles Comiskey was a cheap asshole as well. And I think that it adds to why the players could logically do this. And that is something that I very much appreciate. I think there's certain movies that I think would like try to take a perspective on this and either take the player side or take the owner side. But I think John Sayles does a really good job of creating a nuanced take on this and in sort of like showing just how everybody was a little bit wrong. And I think that there is a lot of sympathy to the players, but he doesn't let them off the hook, which I like. The Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis angle of it all is not that well addressed. That would probably be my biggest critique is just the way that they bring him in, that, bringing him in as the law and order of baseball. But I mean, there's a lot to him as a person that they could have got into, but they didn't. But for the most part, like I said, I just think that they did a really good job of casting. I love that they start with the kids and just the way that they use the journalists as well. So Studs Terkel, who is a Chicago icon and who was 7 years old at the time of the Black Sox scandal, is in this movie, and he's 75 years old. Hugh Fullerton in 1919, it was 46 years old, so not exactly accurate. But Studs Terkel adds a ton of flavor, and it really lends to the authenticity. John Sayles plays Ring Larner, and I sent Brian a picture of the actual Ring Larner. And Brian, what was your reaction when you saw the picture of John Sayles, a screenshot from the movie, and then the actual Ring Larner?
Kind of shocking that it was almost spot on. The director got it like spot on with his own casting, but the eyebrows is what got me. I was like looking at the eyebrows and I was like, okay, this guy clearly was born to play this role and direct the movie itself. And a little background too on the movie is like, I guess it took 11 years to make, and that's just one of those passion projects that kind of like it's not exactly fulfilling, but I feel like it's fulfilling now. Like all these, like kind of looking back, 30 years later. I think it's, obviously this wasn't a hit at the time, like I mentioned. Like this had a budget of 6 million, grossed 5.7 million. So that tells you this is not like the kind of movie that Field of Dreams is. It's not like a movie that's going to leave you with a happy ending. It's going to leave you with a realistic ending. And you do sympathize with the players, which I really appreciate, because right at the beginning of the movie, I was already sympathizing with them. Like, dude, I would do the same, dude. Like I honestly would do the same. Like I feel like they were getting screwed over, and they showed that properly, and they just showed like, hey, this is the mindset. And the poor guy, like you talk about David Strathairn and as Eddie Sakati as like a pitcher that's going for 30 games, which is insane. He gets 29 games, and his owner like is like, I'm not gonna give you a bonus. The bonus was for 30. I would have given the guy a bonus if he was that close. You know what I'm saying? Like, what an asshole. And the fact that he's like celebrating with flat champagne for the team, what a what a cheap asshole. So yeah, I was just kind of like appalled at the treatment of the players. So it just explains a lot, and the mentality of it all. And I was just kind of like, okay, this explains a hell of a lot as to why they were all like, oh, fuck this guy. You know what I mean? Like, let's just make our own shit, and fuck, who cares about winning a World Series? We need a fucking Vader family. So I get it, man. And it just makes so much sense now when you see it in this perspective, in this light. That, for a situation like this, it's obvious that you need to pay your players. You know what I'm saying? You need to pay your players. Don't go cheap on them, obviously. And that kind of leads to, oh, you're paying them too much, and these different arguments. But if you don't pay them enough, obviously they're gonna do crazy shit like this, and it's very plausible even today. I mean, look at like the Pete Rose situation. He was betting on his own team back in the day. So, as to why, I don't know. You know what I'm saying? Jordan bet on sports. We don't know if he bet on himself, but it's some kind of mentality.
There's no way he would have bet on basketball. I mean, they would have absolutely found that information out. I mean, there's a lot of conspiracy theories about Jordan retiring and whether it was like a secret suspension or whatever. But I mean, look, Michael Jordan clearly had a gambling problem that has a lot to do with his competitiveness. And again, the issue of gambling, and it becomes all the more pronounced because gambling, again, is so ubiquitous now that these apps are heavily advertised during pregame shows, during games, like going over the over and unders and all that stuff. And I mean, it's gotten really annoying, man. Like I find it harder to actually watch and enjoy games because the level of gambling is just so prevalent now. And like in some ways, it was better when Al Michaels or Brent Musburger would like secretly announce or like make reference to the line. Like that was cheeky and cute, but like now it's just so out there, and it makes for a less fun viewing experience. And I would love to know like people who are super not into gambling, because I dabble. Like I'm certainly not somebody who is on the apps on a regular basis, but I'll play it and place a bet or two once in a while in the Super Bowl. I will get involved in a March Madness pool. But I mean, you look at where we're going, and it just feels like gambling is just going to become even more and more important. And quite honestly, the money that's being thrown out there by the DraftKings and the FanDuels, I mean, it's really propping up these leagues. It's propping up some of these different sports media entities as well. And eventually that bubble is going to burst. And I certainly question the profitability, but it's also a situation where gambling is very much not going anywhere. And within the context of this story, you just realize just how potentially dangerous it is, because you're not only throwing in the integrity of the game, but you are also it just looks bad. Like the way that these players are clearly throwing it, it just looks embarrassing. And that's the worst thing of all. And my favorite performance is Gordon Clapp as Ray Schulk. So Ray Schulk is the catcher. The reason that it's my favorite performance, Brian, is that he is just so exacerbated the entire movie. Like he's like, it's almost exaggerated, his performance. and the way that he's shouting, and he's just so frustrated, and is either incredibly naive or just doesn't understand what's going on. I absolutely loved what he was doing because he just comes across as being so naive and innocent compared to what's actually going on. And I really liked it. It was funny to me just how exaggerated his anger was.
Yeah, I think his performance is really good. He's been on other cop shows, right? He's like on NYPD Blue or something.
I think he's probably best known for NYPD. Yeah.
Okay, for sure. It's sad because the further the series goes on, the more sad you feel for the guy. I feel because he's trying so hard, and you can tell, like, okay, for example, Charlie Sheen's character, he just blatantly drops the ball in the outfield, and it looks beyond bad. I don't know if that was happened in real life or that's based on the real play from real life, but it looks obviously like you're throwing the game, and I think that's like I think it broke his heart almost, that catcher, because I'm just feeling like, okay, they won game 3 and then they win game 5. And I'm just like, dude, they're throwing you these carrots, and it's only just to stretch the series out, and God, I don't know. It's not naivete. I think he was hoping that the guys would just snap out of it and just maybe forget the whole, forget about the bet thing and just try to win the series in the end. In reality, they just kind of wanted to stretch the series. It just seemed like the 8 games out of 9, and it was just really sad, man. And then you talk about these gambling apps, right? I would say that the Michael Lerner character, Rothstein, I would say he would probably be in, if this was like a modern kind of telling, he would be owner of like DraftKings or something like that. You know what I'm saying? Something crazy like that. But in this case, I think Michael Lerner, we talked about him before on the Academy Awards 92 podcast, where I thought he got nominated for like the smallest role. But in this case, he should have been nominated for this, because this was way better than that role he had in that Coen Brothers movie, Barton Fink.
I don't know. I don't think he was shady enough. I think that's my thing. It just feels like Rothstein. The Michael Lerner character just doesn't feel like he's in control, and the impression that I get with Rothstein is that he is very much in control of this situation. And the old joke about him that is referenced in the Ken Burns documentary is that the only reason he wouldn't bet on the weather is because he couldn't control it. And I think that's very much true in this case, because I mean, he clearly was able to control a literal World Series, and that's just something that would have been thought as being impossible before, but it eventually happens. And yeah, I think again the performances across the board are good. I mean, you get to see Michael Rooker, kind of an early version of the kind of typical character that he plays, the guy who's very shady. And the most impressive thing, of course, is his hair. And I don't know, the first time I remember seeing Michael Rooker was in Mallrats, so I always associate him with being bald. But the reality is he's not bald generally. And yeah, I think John Cusack is playing kind of the all American boy, like being really like trying to be a good guy, like he knows what's going on, but seemingly has no role in the actual situation. I loved his interactions with John Mahoney, especially given that they would be in Say Anything just a year later. So I appreciated that. But I know that there was one specific aspect to this movie that I think both of us did not really appreciate. And I think it's time to talk about Shoeless Joe Jackson.
Okay, so I don't know if I wanted more of it. Like, I think his story is just kind of like this weird story where like he's illiterate and he's taken advantage of, but we don't know to the extent of how much he's taken advantage of. And I feel like I don't know, he either got screwed over or he really didn't know that he was being part of like a fix scandal. It's very weird because you don't know what's going through his head. You know what I'm saying? So I feel like they should have explored that a little more and give him a little more of a focus, but they just kind of put him as like a side character. And then, with Field of Dreams coming out the next year, and we saw the Ray Liotta interpretation of the character, it almost feels like Field of Dreams and this movie are kind of pseudo sequel prequels to each other. But this idea that Shoeless Joe Jackson has been banned for life and he was never unbanned, I don't know. It's hard to, like, I don't know all the details, you know what I mean? So I would have to do more research as to whether or not he was part of the scandal or not. Because the way the film interprets it, it seems like he just didn't know what was going on. And then once he knew what was going on, he felt guilty and tried to get out of it, or he couldn't get out of it, or didn't know how to get out of it, and he was just being manipulated. So it was very weird. But the performance by DB Sweeney was interesting because considering that he was left-handed, Shoeless Joe, and he had to train right-handed, I always find that fascinating when you got to train for the sports roles and you kind of got to maybe switch from lefty to righty or something like that. So that was kind of a tough role to kind of get into, considering that it's kind of a historic role. But they didn't give him a lot of shine, is unfortunately. So I kind of wanted more out of that character in this movie. I don't not want necessarily a whole thing about Shoeless Joe Jackson. I'm just kind of more fascinated as to him being illiterate and him being used and not knowing or whether or not he knew what he was doing.
Yeah, it's DB Sweeney portrays him as being very stupid and very like just a rube. And I don't know. It's a very odd performance to me. And I think I needed more from Joe Jackson in terms of the character. Because like he's the best player on the team. He led the team in batting average in the World Series. Babe Ruth modeled his swing after Joe Jackson. So he's a pretty important player, and I think he's been lost to history because of the Black Sox scandal. But if you look at who the players who have the highest batting average of all time, Joe Jackson is second on the list behind Ty Cobb. And you're probably not going to see anyone ever have a lifetime average of 350 again, which is pretty wild. And, this is a guy who hit 356 in about 12 seasons. The home run numbers aren't really there, but home runs weren't really hit that much. He's just a really impressive guy, and it just feels like he's so dumb. And I don't know, like I understand that he can't read, but just because you can't read doesn't mean you're completely stupid either. And I don't know, to be that good of a ball player, I think you have to have some level of intelligence. And like later on in his life, he was playing under assumed names and whatnot. I just don't know that somebody like that could just function. I mean, again, I accept the fact that he was unable to read, and that certainly would have hindered him in many ways. But I think the idea of making him this stupid kind of it reduces the character for me in a way that I feel like a lot of the other characters are given a certain level of nuance and sympathy, especially Buck Weaver, throughout the movie in the courtroom. And it feels like, again, a lot of these guys, even a Bill Burns is played by Christopher Lloyd. Like, you get to know his character a little bit, and you get to kind of know his moral limitations. But again, Shoeless Joe Jackson, like, all he is a guy who can't read, and he's getting heckled in his own stadium by fans in that last regular season game. It's very unusual to me.
Yeah, I think the portrayal by Ray Liotta is going to be the more memorable one. Obviously, that's the one people remember most, and he was only in it for 5-10 minutes, but I think he played it with more of like a sturdy head, so to speak, someone who knew that.
I mean, that's completely different. I mean, Field of Dreams is a fairy tale. I don't necessarily I'm not going to evaluate it as the actual Joe Jackson. I'm going to evaluate it as like this is the fairy tale version of a baseball movie. So this is very different. I mean, if Ray Liotta did a biopic of Shoeless Joe Jackson, I'm sure that it would be really, really good. But I don't take the Field of Dreams performance as like quote unquote like canon, or it's not to me designed to be realistic, and that's fine. Like I'm not asking it to be, because Field of Dreams again is a fairy tale. This is like the grittier version of the story.
For sure, and I'm glad this movie's like a 2-hour movie. I'm glad it didn't overstay its welcome. I was willing to sit for like a 2-hour and 15-minute version of this movie, just to get some extra padding and more like character development. But it's fine at 2 hours. I think it's edited well at 2 hours. Has a satisfying ending because after the World Series, it becomes this investigative journalism movie, which I did not expect. And for like 30 minutes, it was like a really good investigative journalism movie for that time period, where they were like the way they were shooting it or the way they were shot. And I wanted to point out there's this one incredible hallway scene in the middle of the movie where some players and the coach start noting, like they realize that the fix is on. And so you see like all these interactions at 2 a.m. at all these different hotel rooms, but you also see the players interacting with the mob people at the same time in the same shot. I think that's an incredible hallway sequence. Super underrated. I don't know if it was maybe exactly one cut, but it did seem like one cut kind of thing. And yeah, it was probably cut up into multiple parts, but it looked fantastic because all the different dialogue going on, all the different storylines going on, and then seeing people in the distance kind of hide and sneak their way into a hotel room kind of thing. Very well done. So yeah, the third act is pretty much that investigative journalism thing that leads to the grand jury. They're innocent, but they're banned from baseball, and that's the end of the movie, and it's sad, but it's a realistic ending. And then, of course, you got John Cusack's character. Buck Weaver, feels like he got screwed over, which he did because he wasn't part of the he saw the meeting take place apparently, quote unquote, but didn't partake in the actual fixing of the game, but was grouped with the players and unfortunately got banned for life as well. So it's a sad ending, but it's a realistic ending, and I like that a lot. And I think that's why it doesn't resonate with a lot of people, like a Field of Dreams or Major League. It's not a happy ending, but it's what it is, and it's presented with realism, and I appreciate that. And I don't think this movie's for a whole lot of like a general audience. I think this is for more like baseball marks like us, it seems like, or history buffs for around that time period, or like gambling. Like people want a history of gambling in the United States. This is definitely part of that history. So I appreciate this film a lot. For me, it's got a lot going on. The only things that kind of hinder it a little bit is like there's very few female characters in this movie, and that's unfortunate. But I feel like we get the opposite of that when League of Their Own comes out a few years later. So we're definitely going to get that aspect and perspective of the baseball culture around that time period from the female perspective. It's lacking that in this film for sure. The soundtrack is not that great either. It's not really memorable considering that the time period has a very unique sounding, old school piano playing, take me out to the ball game type feel, those kind of songs, but it just doesn't stick out. And then of course not enough focus on Shoeless Joe. Maybe give us maybe 5 more 10 minutes more about his perspective on things to kind of give us more of like what's going on in his head. Because again, we don't know if he's actually that, I hate to say dumb, but it feels like because of his
I mean, he almost violates the rule that is said in Tropic Thunder, which I'm not going to repeat here, but you know what I'm talking about.
right, the rule you don't go that far. But if you look at the way he's even shown in the movie, it's like he's got this intelligence in the field, like field play intelligence, baseball intelligence. So I don't know. The portrayal was kind of weird in that aspect. That's why I wanted more exploration of that character, which we didn't get. But overall, 8 out of 10. And just a little quick note here: Kid Gleason. They listed some of his stats on IMDb, and for 19, well, he was coaching in 1918, but I guess 10, 15 years before that he was playing, right? So he pitched about 400 games and played second base at about 1,600 games, which is incredible, like incredible. Not even Shohei Ohtani can pull that off nowadays, even though he's like a utility player like that. It's just crazy how players back in the day, like 100 years ago plus, were just bred differently. And it's not just we're going to focus you as like a single pitcher. We're not going to just make you a second baseman. It was more than that. And you can Babe Ruth was a pitcher and hitter. So I find this kind of time fascinating where you were just more than one, slotted into one position, so to speak. You weren't just going to be focusing on pitching. You'd be focusing on hitting, and even teased a little bit of that when the third string starter on the White Sox got a base hit, and I think he almost got an RBI. So it was a very different time period for sure. Not everyone was trying to be Ohtani, but that was kind of the mindset of let's not just make a player a single position player. Let's make him, utilize, make him more than that. So I like that aspect of the game from back then. Of course, it's changed a lot. Obviously, there's helmets now, but a lot of the game still feels similar to what it was in 1918.
I would agree with you. The lack of female characters is kind of an issue. I don't think it's as pronounced as some of the recent ones we've done, because again, a lot of the main characters are men, so it doesn't bother me as much. The soundtrack, I would agree that it's not memorable, but I think it's serviceable for what they're going for because they're trying to create, I think, a very realistic soundtrack. So this, because it's not a traditional sports movie, it's not building to the crescendo of a happy ending. Like, I think you have to be very careful of what terms of music you're doing. Like, you think about a movie like The Natural, which came out a few years earlier. Like, you get that big sweeping baseball epic moment with Robert Redford hitting the home run, and like it's one of the most memorable baseball soundtracks of all time. Even Bull Durham kind of has that crescendo music. This is not, it wouldn't be appropriate. So I think using period appropriate music, especially when they have that montage. I mean, who doesn't love a good montage in a sports movie? And they're still able to pull that off, I think, pretty well. So while I would agree with you that it is not necessarily memorable, I don't think it takes away from the movie, and I think it keeps up with the vibe of this kind of being something that is realistic and not specifically designed to like inspire somebody to play baseball or enjoy baseball as much. I think the purpose of this movie, John Sayles has much higher aspirations.
For sure. So to kind of like wrap up some Chicago White Sox history for you folks, the next time they would make the World Series was 1959, where they lost to my Dodgers 4-2. And then, of course, that 2005 run where they swept the Astros. I got to tell you, Jerome, I remember that playoff run a lot because it was so out of nowhere. And that was a one-time team. It felt like they made the playoffs the next year and didn't do much with it. There was no All-Stars except maybe one pitcher. And they were just dominant out of nowhere. And for the I say that because I remember the first game in the AL DS was against the Red Sox, and they beat them 14-3. And no one expected that to happen that day. Everyone expected to be almost close, but the Red Sox to edge it out. But no one was expecting 14-3. And I think you remember that game too. Is exactly what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah, I remember that game. I remember Game 3 distinctly as well because Orlando Hernandez struck out batters with the bases loaded, and he got the White Sox out of a really bad jam. That is, I mean, the 2005 White Sox are an important team because that is the last time that you will have 4 consecutive players throw complete games. That happened in the ALCS against the Los Angeles Angels. And that, again, 3 or 4 consecutive complete games. Mark Burley threw a complete game. Freddie Garcia, Jose Contreras, and John Garland all threw complete games for the White Sox in the ALCS. That will never happen again.
Yeah, man, that was a hell of a run, man. Hell of a run that no one expected.
They knocked out Roger Clemens, and I forget which game it was, but they knocked out Roger Clemens early, and that also makes me very happy because fuck that guy.
Okay, that's some baseball rivalry talk for you. So, like I said, we're also going to talk about a little bit of baseball. Right now, it's the start of the season. You know, the Ohtani stuff's going on with the Dodgers, and in terms of my baseball fandom, and I don't know what to expect. If he's gone for the foreseeable future, that's fine. I think I can handle it. I think the team can handle it. But who knows? I don't want to just jump to conclusions because we don't know all the details. He could have just been his interpreter, and some of the details about his interpreter have come out stating that he made up a lot of his background that no one seemingly checked on. And I guess if you're going to blame the Dodgers, blame the Angels for having him for there too, right? He's been the interpreter for how long with Ohtani, and he's with the Angels, and they're not blaming the Angels for anything? Come on. It's the Dodger hate, and I accept that. That's part of signing all the big players and all the hate. I've accepted that. I've experienced that back with the Lakers when they tried to sign all the All-Stars back in 2004, and that didn't really work. It did get them to the finals, though, but it didn't work. But, yeah, I expect them to, kind of get through this. I'm a little worried about guys on base because, my theory, I'm still old school in my baseball kind of like fandom where I kind of want my 1 and 2 guys to be not heavy hitters and just be guys that are on base guys to set up your 3 and 4 heavy hitters. But the Dodgers have completely gone away with that and put Mookie Betts at first.
Most teams don't do that anymore. Most teams put their best hitters in the 1-2 slot now. You very rarely.
I'm so old school in that matter. You know what I'm saying? Like, but I feel like, I don't know. I feel like the old school baseball it plays heavier in the playoffs. And that's what makes the Dodgers weaker in the playoffs in the last couple of years because of that, the switch of the lineups like that. I feel like
I don't think that's. I don't agree at all. I think it's much more about the pitching not being good, and Dave Roberts not being a good manager. I think has much more to do with their issues because managing doesn't really matter in the regular season. I feel like it definitely has more of an effect in the postseason, especially with bullpen management, and that's where it feels like the Dodgers falter more than anything, and we'll have to see how this all plays out this season because Shohei Ohtani's around. The pitching is going to be a question mark, and a bunch of guys are on the DL. But I mean, they're still going to go in as the favorite. And look, I think the fundamental problem with baseball right now is that every year a third of the teams are not even trying to win, and it just feels like the regular season at times feels very perfunctory and it feels very non-competitive. Like at the top, you're going to have 3-4 teams win 100 games, and you might have 3-4 teams lose 100 games. And I don't think that's good. I don't think that's good for the sport. And I mean, you look at the AL Central specifically. I mean, none of those teams want to spend and it makes for a very not fun season. And look, if people want to criticize the Dodgers for spending money, they should be spending equal amounts of time um, yelling at the teams for not spending money and being non-competitive.
Thank you. I've been arguing that for years. Thank you. Thank you. But in terms of your White Sox, I don't know, man. It seems to be kind of a rehash of the 1918 sentiment with the ownership and
I will certainly not be watching a lot of White Sox baseball. That's for sure this year.
yeah, considering that they were on a playoff run 2 years ago, and even that was kind of a questionable run. Like you were not even having any faith in that run 2 years ago, and you were right. They only won. I don't even think they won one game in that run. So
No, I mean
yeah,
they got embarrassed by the Astros. I mean, again, they rightfully fired Rick Renteria and they brought in 70,000-year-old Tony La Russa, and it was bad. And this it felt like this team had a real shot, but they didn't, and now they had to break it up. And just every prospect that they thought was going to deliver just hasn't, and it's a big mess now.
for sure. So that kind of wraps up this discussion of inning one of this baseball project for the year. Like I said, it's going to kind of coincide with the 2024 baseball season. I believe we'll have a multi-episode month just to make it 9, because this is going to go on till October, folks. So that's an 8-month run starting here in March. And of course, they already started the season in Seoul, South Korea. The Dodgers are 1-1 right now. So opening day is going to be this week. The episode is going to be releasing this week. I think I might just release it on opening day. I'm not sure, which is Thursday, March 28th. I'm going to Vegas for opening day to just kind of play some bets and get away from work. But yeah, the whole gambling thing, it all comes full circle, right? So on the next episode next week, I'm not quite sure what we're doing yet, but in the next baseball centric episode, inning 2, so to speak, which will be Major League from 1989, that will be at the beginning, or actually, I guess we'll stick with this thing. We'll put it at the end of the month. So you'll look forward to Major League at the end of April coming your way next month.
Brian, I don't know if you realize this, but we do actually have a plan for the first week in April.
I forgot it. That's why I need you to cue it up for us.
So we are going to be doing our Rent Match series, and I am so excited for this one because Brian and we did a YouTube exclusive where we discussed the first 2 episodes of X-Men 97, but we need to talk about X-Men the Animated Series. We are going to be going over our top 5 favorite episodes of the mid-90s X-Men series, and we are going to be pairing it up with a match from the last WWF Saturday Night's Main Event of that specific era, the late 80s, early 90s. We will be talking about Shawn Michaels versus the British Bulldog for the WWF Intercontinental title from the Saturday Night's Main Event, and I will explain the connection between those 2 things next week. And then in 2 weeks, as we will be doing our baseball series at the end of April, we are going to release a very special episode of the Not Content podcast where Ben Phillips returns to the co-host chair, and we are going to discuss our Disney list. Ben and I have watched every theatrically released Disney movie, all 62 of them, in a series of 3 episodes that will be slow rolled throughout the rest of the year. Ben and I will discuss our list. We'll be discussing numbers 62 through 42 in 2 weeks. So you got that to look forward to.
Which also means that in the coming future or in the incoming episodes, you will hear Jerome talk about Chicken Little, which I thought I would never, ever hear, ever. So there you go. So I'm Brian. That's Jerome. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon on the channel.